The History of Hudge and Gudge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What's Wrong with the World by G.K. Chesterton. Part 1. The Homelessness of Man. Chapter 9. History of Hudge and Gudge. There is, let us say, a certain filthy rookery in Hoxton, dripping with disease and honeycombed with crime and promiscuity. There are, let us say, two noble and courageous young men, of pure intentions, and, if you prefer it, noble birth. Let us call them Hudge and Gudge. Hudge, let us say, is of a bustling sort. He points out that the people must at all costs be got out of this den. He subscribes and collects money, but he finds, despite the large financial interests of the Hudges, that the thing will have to be done on the cheap if it is to be done on the spot. He therefore runs up a row of tall, bare tenements like beehives, and soon has all the poor people bundled into their little brick cells, which are certainly better than their old quarters, insofar that they are weatherproof, well ventilated, and supplied with clean water. But Gudge has a more delicate nature. He feels a nameless something lacking in the little brick boxes. He raises numberless objections. He even assails the celebrated Hudge Report with the Gudge Minority Report, and by the end of a year or so has come to telling Hudge heatedly that the people were much happier where they were before. As the people persevere in both places precisely the same air of dazed amiability, it is very difficult to find out which is right. But at least one might safely say that no people ever liked stench or starvation as such, but only some peculiar pleasures entangled with them. Not so feels the sensitive Gudge. Long before the final quarrel, Hudge v. Gudge, and another, Gudge has succeeded in persuading himself that slums and stinks are really very nice things, that the habit of sleeping 14 in a room is what has made our England great, and that the smell of open drains is absolutely essential to the rearing of a Viking breed. But, meanwhile, has there been no degeneration in Hudge? Alas, I fear there has. Those maniacally ugly buildings which he originally put up as unpretentious sheds, barely to shelter human life, grow every day more and more lovely in his deluded eye. Things he would never have dreamed of defending, except as crude necessities, things like common kitchens or infamous asbestos stoves, begin to shine quite sacredly before him, merely because they reflect the wrath of Gudge. He maintains, with the aid of eager little books by socialists, that man is really happier in a hive than in a house. The practical difficulty of keeping total strangers out of your bedroom he describes as brotherhood, and the necessity for climbing 23 flights of cold stone stairs, I dare say he calls effort. The net result of their philanthropic adventure is this, that one has come to defending indefensible slums and still more indefensible slum landlords, while the other has come to treating as divine the sheds and pipes which he only meant as desperate. Gudge is now a corrupt and apoplectic old Tory in the Carlton Club. If you mention poverty to him, he roars at you in a thick, hoarse voice, something that is conjectured to be, "Do 'em good." Nor is Hudge more happy, for he is a lean vegetarian with a gray pointed beard and an unnaturally easy smile, who goes about telling everybody that at last we shall all sleep in one universal bedroom, and he lives in a garden city, like one forgotten of God. Such is the lamentable history of Hudge and Gudge, which I merely introduce as a type of an endless and exasperating misunderstanding which is always occurring in modern England. To get men out of the rookery, men are put into a tenement, and at the beginning the healthy human soul loathes them both. A man's first desire is to get away as far as possible from the rookery, even should his mad course lead him to a model dwelling. The second desire is, naturally, to get away from the model dwelling, even if it should lead a man back to the rookery. But I am neither a Hudgian nor a Gudgian, and I think the mistakes of these two famous and fascinating persons arose from one simple fact. They arose from the fact that neither Hudge nor Gudge had ever thought for an instant what sort of a house a man might probably like for himself. In short, they did not begin with the ideal, and therefore were not practical politicians. We may now return to the purpose of our awkward parenthesis about the praise of the future and the failures of the past. A house of his own being the obvious ideal for every man, we may now ask, taking this need as typical of all such needs, why he hasn't got it, and whether it is in any philosophical sense his own fault. Now, I think that in some philosophical sense it is his own fault. I think in a yet more philosophical sense it is the fault of his philosophy. And this is what I have now to attempt to explain. Burke, a fine rhetorician who rarely faced realities, said, I think that an Englishman's house is his castle. This is honestly entertaining, for as it happens the Englishman is almost the only man in Europe whose house is not his castle. Nearly everywhere else exists the assumption of peasant proprietorship, that a poor man may be a landlord, though he is only lord of his own land. Making the landlord and the tenant the same person has certain trivial advantages, as that the tenant pays no rent while the landlord does a little work, and I am not concerned with the defense of small proprietorship, but merely with the fact that it exists almost everywhere except in England. It is also true, however, that this state of small possession is attacked everywhere today. It has never existed among ourselves, and it may be destroyed among our neighbors. We have, therefore, to ask ourselves what it is in human affairs generally, and in this domestic ideal in particular, that has really ruined the natural human creation, especially in this country. Man has always lost his way. He has been a tramp ever since Eden, but he always knew, or thought he knew, what he was looking for. Every man has a house somewhere in the elaborate cosmos. His house waits for him, waist-deep in slow Norfolk rivers, or sunning itself upon Sussex downs. Man has always been looking for that home which is the subject matter of this book, but in the bleak and blinding hail of skepticism to which he has been now so long subjected, he has begun for the first time to be chilled, not merely in his hopes, but in his desires. For the first time in history he begins really to doubt the object of his wanderings on the earth. He has always lost his way, but now he has lost his address. Under the pressure of certain upper-class philosophies, or in other words, under the pressure of Hudge and Gudge, the average man has really become bewildered about the goal of his efforts, and his efforts, therefore, grow feebler and feebler. His simple notion of having a house of his own is derided as bourgeois, as sentimental, or as despicably Christian. Under various verbal forms he is recommended to go on to the streets, which is called individualism, or to the workhouse, which is called collectivism. We shall consider this process somewhat more carefully in a moment, but it may be said here that Hudge and Gudge, or the governing class generally, will never fail for lack of some modern phrase to cover their ancient predominance. The great lords will refuse the English peasant his 3 acres and a cow on advanced grounds, if they cannot refuse it longer on reactionary grounds. They will deny him the 3 acres on grounds of state ownership. They will forbid him the cow on grounds of humanitarianism. And this brings us to the ultimate analysis of this singular influence that has prevented doctrinal demands by the English people. There are, I believe, some who will still deny that England is governed by an oligarchy. It is quite enough for me to know that a man might have gone to sleep some 30 years ago over the day's newspaper and woke up last week over the latter newspaper and fancied he was reading about the same people. In one paper he would have found a Lord Robert Cecil, a Mr. Gladstone, a Mr. Littleton, a Churchill, a Chamberlain, a Trevelyan, an Acland. In the other paper he would have found a Lord Robert Cecil, a Mr. Gladstone, a Mr. Littleton, a Churchill, a Chamberlain, a Trevelyan, an Acland. If this is not being governed by families, I cannot imagine what it is. I suppose it is being governed by extraordinary democratic coincidences. End of The History of Hudge and Gudge, recorded by Craig Campbell in Appleton, Wisconsin in 2009.
Oppression by Optimism. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Holdsworth. What's Wrong with the World by G. K. Chesterton, Part 1, Chapter 10. Oppression by Optimism. But we are not here concerned with the nature and existence of the aristocracy, but with the origin of its peculiar power. Why is it the last of the true oligarchies of Europe, and why does there seem no very imminent prospect of our seeing the end of it? The explanation is simple, though it remains strangely unnoticed. The friends of the aristocracy often praise it for preserving ancient and gracious traditions. The enemies of aristocracy often blame it for clinging to cruel or antiquated customs. Both its enemies and its friends are wrong. Generally speaking, the aristocracy does not preserve either good or bad traditions. It does not preserve anything except game. Who would dream of looking among aristocrats anywhere for an old custom? One might as well look for an old costume. The god of the aristocrats is not tradition, but fashion, which is the opposite of tradition. If you wanted to find an old-world Norwegian headdress, would you look for it in the Scandinavian smart set? No. The aristocrats never have customs. At the best, they have habits, like the animals. Only the mob has customs. The real power of the English aristocrats has lain in exactly the opposite of tradition. The simple key to the power of our upper classes is this, that they have always kept carefully on the side of what is called progress. They have always been up to date, and this comes quite easy to an aristocracy. For the aristocracy are the supreme instances of that frame of mind of which we spoke just now. Novelty is to them a luxury verging on a necessity. They, above all, are so bored with the past and with the present that they gape with a horrible hunger for the future. But whatever else the great lords forgot, they never forgot that it was their business to stand for the new things, for whatever was being most talked about among university dons or fussy financiers. Thus they were on the side of the Reformation against the Church, of the Whigs against the Stuarts, of the Baconian science against the old philosophy, of the manufacturing system against the operatives, and, today, of the increased power of the state against the old-fashioned individualists. In short, the rich are always modern. It is their business. But the immediate effect of this fact upon the question we are studying is somewhat singular. In each of the separate holes or quandaries in which the ordinary Englishman has been placed, he has been told that his situation is, for some particular reason, all for the best. He woke up one fine morning and discovered that the public things, which for 800 years he had used at once as inns and sanctuaries, had all been suddenly and savagely abolished, to increase the private wealth of about 6 or 7 men. One would think he might have been annoyed at this. In many places he was, and was put down by the soldiery. But it was not merely the army that kept him quiet. He was kept quiet by the sages as well as the soldiers. The 6 or 7 men who took away the inns of the poor told him that they were not doing it for themselves, but for the religion of the future, the great dawn of Protestantism and truth. So whenever a 17th century noble was caught pulling down a peasant's fence and stealing his field, the noble pointed excitedly at the face of Charles I or James II, which at that moment perhaps wore a cross expression, and thus diverted the simple peasant's attention. The great Puritan lords created the Commonwealth and destroyed the common land. They saved their poorer countrymen from the disgrace of paying ship money by taking from them the plough money and spade money, which they were doubtless too weak to guard. A fine old English rhyme has immortalized this aristocratic habit. You prosecute the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but leave the larger felon loose who steals the common from the goose. But here, as in the case of the monasteries, we confront the strange problem of submission. If they stole the common from the goose, one can only say that he was a great goose to stand it. The truth is, they reasoned with the goose. They explained to him that all this was needed to get the Stuart fox overseas. So in the 19th century, the great nobles who became mine owners and railway directors earnestly assured everybody that they did not do this from preference, but owing to a newly discovered economic law. So the prosperous politicians of our own generation introduced bills to prevent poor mothers from going about with their own babies, or they calmly forbid their tenants to drink beer in public inns. But this insolence is not, as you would suppose, howled at by everybody as outrageous feudalism. It is gently rebuked as socialism, for an aristocracy is always progressive. It is a form of going the pace. Their parties grow later and later at night, for they are trying to live tomorrow. End of Oppression by Optimism. Of Jones. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Holdsworth. What's Wrong with the World by G.K. Chesterton, Part 1, Chapter 11. The Homelessness of Jones. Thus, the future of which we spoke at the beginning has, in England at least, always been the ally of tyranny. The ordinary Englishman has been duped out of his old possessions, such as they were, and always in the name of progress. The destroyers of the abbeys took away his bread and gave him a stone, assuring him that it was a precious stone, the white pebble of the Lord's elect. They took away his maypole and his original rural life, and promised him instead the golden age of peace and commerce inaugurated at the Crystal Palace. And now they are taking away the little that remains of his dignity as a householder and the head of a family, promising him instead utopias which are called, appropriately enough, anticipations or news from nowhere. We come back, in fact, to the main feature which has already been mentioned. The past is communal, the future must be individualist. In the past are all the evils of democracy, variety and violence and doubt, but the future is pure despotism, for the future is pure caprice. Yesterday I know I was a human fool, but tomorrow I can easily be the Superman. The modern Englishman, however, is like a man who should be perpetually kept out, for one reason after another, from the house in which he had meant his married life to begin. This man, Jones let us call him, has always desired the divinely ordinary things. He has married for love. He has chosen or built a small house that fits like a coat. He is ready to be a great-grandfather and a local god. and just as he is moving in, something goes wrong. Some tyranny, personal or political, suddenly debars him from the home, and he has to take his meals in the front garden. A passing philosopher, who is also, by mere coincidence, the man who turned him out, pauses and, leaning elegantly on the railing, explains to him that he is now living that bold life upon the bounty of nature which will be the life of the sublime future. He finds life in the front garden more bold than bountiful, and has to move into mean lodgings in the next spring. The philosopher who turned him out, happening to call at these lodgings, with the probable intention of raising the rent, stops to explain to him that he is now in the real life of mercantile endeavour. The economic struggle between him and the landlady is the only thing out of which, in the sublime future, the wealth of nations can come. He is defeated in the economic struggle and goes to the workhouse. The philosopher who turns him out, happening at that very moment to be inspecting the workhouse, assures him that he is now at last in that golden republic which is the goal of mankind. He is in an equal, scientific, socialistic commonwealth, owned by the state and ruled by public officers. In fact, the commonwealth of the sublime future. Nevertheless, there are signs that the irrational Jones still dreams at night of this old idea of having an ordinary home. He asked for so little and has been offered so much. He has been offered bribes of worlds and systems. He has been offered Eden and Utopia and the New Jerusalem, and he only wanted a house, and that has been refused him. Such an apologue is literally no exaggeration of the facts of English history. The rich did literally turn the poor out of the old guest house onto the road, briefly telling them that it was the road of progress. They did literally force them into factories and the modern wage slavery, assuring them all the time that this was the only way to wealth and civilization. Just as they had dragged the rustic from the convent food and ale by saying that the streets of heaven were paved with gold, so now they dragged him from the village food and ale by telling him that the streets of London were paved with gold. As he entered the gloomy porch of Puritanism, so he entered the gloomy porch of industrialism, being told that each of them was the gate of the future. Hitherto he has only gone from prison to prison, nay, into darkening prisons, for Calvinism opened one small window upon heaven. And now he is asked, in the same educated and authoritative tones, to enter another dark porch, at which he has to surrender into unseen hands his children, his small possessions, and all the habits of his fathers. Whether this last opening be in truth any more inviting than the old openings of Puritanism and industrialism can be discussed later, but there can be little doubt, I think, that if some form of collectivism is imposed upon England, it will be imposed, as everything else has been, by an instructed political class upon a people partly apathetic and partly hypnotized. The aristocracy will be as ready to administer collectivism as they were to administer Puritanism or Manchesterism. In some ways, such a centralized political power is necessarily attractive to them. It will not be so hard as some innocent socialists seem to suppose to induce the Honourable Tom Noddy to take over the milk supply as well as the stamp supply at an increased salary. Mr. Bernard Shaw has remarked that rich men are better than poor men on parish councils because they are free from financial timidity. Now the English ruling class is quite free from financial timidity. The Duke of Sussex will be quite ready to be the administrator of Sussex at the same screw. Sir William Harcourt, that typical aristocrat, put it quite correctly. We, that is, the aristocracy, are all socialists now. But this is not the essential note on which I desire to end. My main contention is that, whether necessary or not, both industrialism and collectivism have been accepted as necessities, not as naked ideals or desires. Nobody liked the Manchester School. It was endured as the only way of producing wealth. Nobody likes the Marxian school. It is endured as the only way of preventing poverty. Nobody's real heart is in the idea of preventing a free man from owning his own farm, or an old woman from cultivating her own garden, any more than anybody's real heart was in the heartless battle of the machines. The purpose of this chapter is sufficiently served in indicating that this proposal is also a pis-aller, a desperate second best, like teetotalism. I do not propose to prove here that socialism is a poison. It is enough if I maintain that it is a medicine and not a wine. The idea of private property universal but private, the idea of families free but still families, of domesticity democratic but still domestic, of one man, one house, this remains the real vision and magnet of mankind. The world may accept something more official and general, less human and intimate, but the world will be like a broken-hearted woman who makes a humdrum marriage because she may not make a happy one. Socialism may be the world's deliverance, but it is not the world's desire. End of The Homelessness of Jones.
The Charm of Jingoism. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What's Wrong with the World by G.K. Chesterton. Part 2. Imperialism or the Mistake About Man. Chapter 1. The Charm of Jingoism. I have cast about widely to find a title for this section, and I confess that the word imperialism is a clumsy version of my meaning, but no other word came nearer. Militarism would have been even more misleading, and the Superman makes nonsense of any discussion that he enters. Perhaps upon the whole the word Caesarism would have been better, but I desire a popular word, and imperialism, as the reader will perceive, does cover for the most part the men and theories that I mean to discuss. This small confusion is increased, however, by the fact that I do also disbelieve in imperialism in its popular sense, as a mode or theory of the patriotic sentiment of this country. But popular imperialism in England has very little to do with the sort of Caesarian imperialism I wish to sketch. I differ from the colonial idealism of Rhodes and Kipling, but I do not think, as some of its opponents do, that it is an insolent creation of English harshness and rapacity. Imperialism, I think, is a fiction created not by English hardness, but by English softness, nay, in a sense, even by English kindness. The reasons for believing in Australia are mostly as sentimental as the most sentimental reasons for believing in heaven. New South Wales is quite literally regarded as a place where the wicked cease from troubling and the weary are at rest. That is, a paradise for uncles who have turned dishonest and for nephews who are born tired. British Columbia is in strict sense a fairyland. It is a world where a magic and irrational luck is supposed to attend the youngest sons. This strange optimism about the ends of the earth is an English weakness, but to show that it is not a coldness or a harshness, it is quite sufficient to say that no one shared it more than that gigantic English sentimentalist, the great Charles Dickens. The end of David Copperfield is unreal, not merely because it is an optimistic ending, but because it is an imperialistic ending. The decorous British happiness planned out for David Copperfield and Agnes would be embarrassed by the perpetual presence of the hopeless tragedy of Emily or the more hopeless farce of Micawber. Therefore, both Emily and Micawber are shipped off to a vague colony where changes come over them with no conceivable cause, except the climate. The tragic woman becomes contented, and the comic man becomes responsible, solely as a result of a sea voyage and the first sight of a kangaroo. To imperialism in the light political sense, therefore, my only objection is that it is an illusion of comfort, that an empire whose heart is failing should be specially proud of the extremities is to me no more sublime a fact than that an old dandy whose brain is gone should still be proud of his legs. It consoles men for the evident ugliness and apathy of England with legends of fair youth and heroic strenuousness in distant continents and islands. A man can sit amid the squalor of 7 Dials and feel that life is innocent and godlike in the bush or on the veldt. Just so, a man might sit in the squalor of 7 Dials and feel that life was innocent and godlike in Brixton and Surbiton. Brixton and Surbiton are new. They are expanding. They are near to nature, in the sense that they have eaten up nature mile by mile. The only objection is the objection of fact. The young men of Brixton are not young giants. The lovers of Surbiton are not all pagan poets singing with the sweet energy of the spring, nor are the people of the colonies, when you meet them, young giants and pagan poets. They are mostly cockneys who have lost their last music of real things by getting out of the sound of bow bells. Mr. Rudyard Kipling, a man of real though decadent genius, threw a theoretic glamour over them which is already fading. Mr. Kipling is, in a precise and rather startling sense, the exception that proves the rule, for he has imagination of an oriental and cruel kind, but he has it, not because he grew up in a new country, but precisely because he grew up in the oldest country upon earth. He is rooted in a past, an Asiatic past. He might never have written Kubal River if he had been born in Melbourne. I say frankly, therefore, lest there should be an air of evasion, that imperialism, in its common patriotic pretensions, appears to me both weak and perilous. It is the attempt of a European country to create a kind of sham Europe which it can dominate, instead of the real Europe which it can only share. It is a love of living with one's inferiors. The notion of restoring the Roman Empire by oneself and for oneself is a dream that has haunted every Christian nation in a different shape, and in almost every shape as a snare. The Spanish are a consistent and conservative people. Therefore they embodied that attempt at empire in long and lingering dynasties. The French are a violent people, and therefore they twice conquered that empire by violence of arms. The English are above all a poetic and optimistic people, and therefore their empire is something vague and yet sympathetic, something distant and yet dear. But this dream of theirs of being powerful in the uttermost places, though a native weakness, is still a weakness in them, much more of a weakness than gold was to Spain or glory to Napoleon. If ever we were in collision with our real brothers and rivals, we should leave all this fancy out of account. We should no more dream of pitting Australian armies against German than of pitting Tasmanian sculpture against French. I have thus explained, lest anyone should accuse me of concealing an unpopular attitude, why I do not believe in imperialism as commonly understood. I think it not merely an occasional wrong to other people, but a continuous feebleness, a running sore in my own. But it is also true that I have dwelt on this imperialism that is an amiable delusion, partly in order to show how different it is from the deeper, more sinister, and yet more persuasive thing that I have been forced to call imperialism for the convenience of this chapter. In order to get to the root of this evil and quite un-English imperialism, we must cast back and begin anew with a more general discussion of the first needs of human intercourse. End of Charm of Jingoism. Read by Craig Campbell in Appleton, Wisconsin in 2009.
Wisdom and the Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dave Volker. What's Wrong with the World by G.K. Chesterton. Part 2. Imperialism or the Mistake About Man. Chapter 2. Wisdom and the Weather. It is admitted, one may hope, that common things are never commonplace. Birth is covered with curtains precisely because it is a staggering and monstrous prodigy. Death and first love, though they happen to everybody, can stop one's heart with the very thought of them. But while this is granted, something further may be claimed. It is not merely true that these universal things are strange. It is moreover true that they are subtle. In the last analysis, most common things will be found to be highly complicated. Some men of science do indeed get over the difficulty by dealing only with the easy part of it. Thus they will call first love the instinct of sex, and the awe of death the instinct of self-preservation. But this is only getting over the difficulty of describing peacock green by calling it blue. There is blue in it. That there is a strong and physical element in both romance and the memento mori makes them, if possible, more baffling than if they had been wholly intellectual. No man could say exactly how much his sexuality was colored by a clean love of beauty, or by the mere boyish itch for irrevocable adventures, like running away to sea. No man could say how far his animal dread of the end was mixed up with the mystical traditions touching morals and religion. It is exactly because these things are animal, but not quite animal, that the dance of all the difficulties begins. The materialists analyze the easy part, deny the hard part, and go home to their tea. It is complete error to suppose that because a thing is vulgar, therefore it is not refined, that is, subtle and hard to define. A drawing-room song of my youth which begins, "In the gloaming, O my darling," was vulgar enough as a song. But the connection between human passion and the twilight is none the less an exquisite and even inscrutable thing. Or to take another obvious instance, the jokes about a mother-in-law are scarcely delicate, but the problem of a mother-in-law is extremely delicate. A mother-in-law is subtle because she is a thing like the twilight. She is a mystical blend of two inconsistent things, law and a mother. The caricatures misrepresent her, but they arise out of a real human enigma. Comic Cuts deals with the difficulty wrongly, but it would need George Meredith and his best to deal with the difficulty rightly. The nearest statement about the problem, perhaps, is this. It is not that a mother-in-law must be nasty, but that she must be very nice. But it is best, perhaps, to take in illustration some daily custom we have all heard despised as vulgar or trite. Take, for the sake of argument, the custom of talking about the weather. Stevenson calls it the very nadir and scoff of good conversationalists. Now there are very deep reasons for talking about the weather, reasons that are delicate as well as deep. They lie in layer upon layer of stratified sagacity. First of all, it is a gesture of primeval worship. The sky must be invoked, and to begin everything with the weather is a sort of pagan way of beginning everything with prayer. Jones and Brown talk about the weather, but so do Milton and Shelley. Then it is an expression of that elementary idea in politeness, equality. For the very word politeness is only the Greek for citizenship. the word politeness is akin to the word policeman, a charming thought. Properly understood, the citizen should be more polite than the gentleman. Perhaps the policeman should be the most courtly and elegant of the three. But all good manners must obviously begin with the sharing of something in a simple style. Two men should share an umbrella. If they have not got an umbrella, they should at least share the rain, with all its rich potentialities of wit and philosophy. For he maketh his sun to shine. This is the second element in the weather, its recognition of human equality in that we all have our hats under the dark blue-spangled umbrella of the universe. Arising out of this is the third wholesome strain in the custom. I mean that it begins with the body and with our inevitable bodily brotherhood. All true friendliness begins with fire and food and drink and the recognition of rain or frost. Those who will not begin at the bodily end of things are already prigs, and may soon be Christian Scientists. Each human soul has, in a sense, to enact for itself the gigantic humility of the Incarnation. Every man must descend into the flesh to meet mankind. Briefly, in the mere observation, a fine day, there is the whole great human idea of comradeship. Now, pure comradeship is another of those broad yet bewildering things. We all enjoy it, yet when we come to talk about it we almost always talk nonsense, chiefly because we suppose it to be a simpler affair than it is. It is simple to conduct, but it is by no means simple to analyze. Comradeship is at the most only one half of human life. The other half is love, a thing so different that one might fancy it had been made for another universe. And I do not mean mere sex love. Any kind of concentrated passion, maternal love, or even the fiercer kinds of friendship are in their nature alien to pure comradeship. Both sides are essential to life, and both are known in differing degrees to everybody of every age or sex. But very broadly speaking, it may still be said that women stand for the dignity of love, and men for the dignity of comradeship. I mean that the institution would hardly be expected if the males of the tribe did not mount guard over it. The affections in which women excel have so much more authority and intensity than pure comradeship would be washed away if it were not rallied and guarded in clubs, corps, colleges, banquets, and regiments. Most of us have heard the voice in which the hostess tells her husband not to sit too long over the cigars. It is the dreadful voice of love, seeking to destroy comradeship. All true comradeship has in it those three elements which I have remarked in the ordinary exclamation about the weather. First, it has a sort of broad philosophy like the common sky, emphasizing that we are all under the same cosmic conditions. We are all in the same boat, the winged rock of Mr. Herbert Trench. Secondly, it recognizes this bond as an essential one, for comradeship is simply humanity seen in that one aspect in which men are really equal. The old writers were so entirely wise when they talked of the equality of men, but they were also very wise not to mention women. Women are always authoritarian. They are always above or below. That is why marriage is a sort of poetical seesaw. There are only three things in the world that women do not understand, and they are liberty, equality, and fraternity. But men, a class little understood in the modern world, find these things the breath of their nostrils, and our most learned ladies will not even begin to understand them until they make allowance for this kind of cool camaraderie. Lastly, it contains the third quality of the weather, the insistence upon the body and its indispensable satisfaction. No one has even begun to understand comradeship who does not accept with it a certain hearty eagerness in eating, drinking, or smoking, an uproarious materialism which to many women appears only hoggish. You may call the thing an orgy or a sacrament. It is certainly an essential. It is, at root, a resistance to the superciliousness of the individual. Nay, its very swaggering and howling are humble. In the heart of its rowdiness there is a sort of mad modesty, a desire to melt the separate soul into the mass of unpretentious masculinity. It is a clamorous confession of the weakness of all flesh. No man must be superior to the things that are common to all men. This sort of equality must be bodily and gross and comic. Not only are we all in the same boat, but we are all seasick. The word comradeship just now promises to become as fatuous as the word affinity. There are clubs of a socialist sort where all the members, men and women, call each other comrade. I have no serious emotions, hostile or otherwise, about this particular habit. At the worst it is conventionality, and at the best flirtation. I am convinced here only to point out a rational principle. If you choose to lump all flowers together, lilies and dahlias and tulips and chrysanthemums, and call them all daisies, you will find that you have spoiled the very fine word, daisy. If you choose to call every human attachment comradeship, if you include under that name the respect of a youth for a venerable prophetess, the interest of a man in a beautiful woman who baffles him, the pleasure of a philosophical old fogey in a girl who is impudent and innocent, the end of the meanest quarrel or the beginning of the most mountainous love, if you are going to call all of these comradeship, you will gain nothing. You will only lose a word. Daisies are obvious and universal and open, but they are only one kind of flower. Comradeship is obvious and universal and open, but it is only one kind of affection. It has characteristics that would destroy any other kind. Any one who has known true comradeship in a club or in a regiment knows that this is impersonal. There is a pedantic phrase used in debating clubs which is strictly true to the masculine emotion. They call it speaking to the question. Women speak to each other. Men speak to the subject they are speaking about. Many an honest man has sat in a ring of his 5 best friends under heaven and forgotten who was in the room while he explained some system. This is not peculiar to an intellectual man. Men are all theoretical, whether they are talking about God or about golf. Men are all impersonal, that is to say, Republican. No one remembers after a really good talk who has said the good things. Every man speaks to a visionary multitude, a mystical cloud, that is called the club. It is obvious that this cool and careless quality, which is essential to the collective affection of males, involves disadvantages and dangers. It leads to spitting. It leads to coarse speech. It must lead to these things so long as it is honorable. Comradeship must be in some degree ugly. The moment beauty is mentioned in male friendship, the nostrils are stopped with the smell of abominable things. Friendship must be physically dirty if it is to be morally clean. It must be in its shirt-sleeves. The chaos of habits that always goes along with males when left entirely to themselves has only one honorable cure, and that is the strict discipline of a monastery. Anyone who has seen our unhappy young idealists in East End settlements losing their collars in the wash and living on tinned salmon will fully understand why it was decided by the wisdom of St. Bernard or St. Benedict that if men were to live without women, they must not live without rules. Something of the same sort of artificial exactitude, of course, is obtained in an army, and an army also has to be in many ways monastic, only that it is celibacy without chastity. But these things do not apply to normal married men. These have quite sufficient restraint on their instinctive anarchy in the savage common sense of the other sex. There is only one very timid sort of man that is not afraid of women. End of Wisdom and the Weather. Recording by Dave Volker, St. Louis, Missouri.
Common Vision. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeannie. What's Wrong with the World by G.K. Chesterton. Part 2, Chapter 3, The Common Vision. Now, this masculine love of an open and level camaraderie is the life within all democracies and attempts to govern by debate. Without it, the republic would be a dead formula. Even as it is, of course, the spirit of democracy frequently differs widely from the letter, and a pothouse is often a better test than a parliament. Democracy in its human sense is not arbitrament by the majority. It is not even arbitrament by everybody. It can be more nearly defined as arbitrament by anybody. I mean that it rests on the club habit of taking a total stranger for granted, of assuming certain things to be inevitably common to yourself and him. Only the things that anybody may be presumed to hold have the full authority of democracy. Look out the window and notice the first man who walks by. The Liberals may have swept England with an overwhelming majority, but you would not stake a button that the man is a Liberal. The Bible may be read in all schools and respected in all law courts, but you would not bet a straw that he believes in the Bible. But you would bet your week's wages, let us say, that he believes in wearing clothes. You would bet that he believes that physical courage is a fine thing, or that parents have authority over children. Of course, he may be the millionth man who does not believe these things; if it comes to that, he may be the bearded lady dressed up as a man. But these prodigies are quite a different thing from any mere calculation of numbers. People who hold these views are not a minority, but a monstrosity. But of these universal dogmas that have full democratic authority, the only test is this test of anybody. What you would observe before any newcomer in a tavern, that is the real English law. The first man you see from the window, he is the King of England. The decay of taverns, which is but a part of the general decay of democracy, has undoubtedly weakened this masculine spirit of equality. I remember that a roomful of socialists literally laughed when I told them that there were no two nobler words in all poetry than public house. They thought it was a joke. Why they should think it a joke, since they want to make all houses public houses, I cannot imagine. But if anyone wishes to see the real rowdy egalitarianism which is necessary, to males at least, he can find it as well as anywhere in the great old tavern disputes which come down to us in such books as Boswell's Johnson. It is worth while to mention that one name especially, because the modern world in its morbidity has done it a strange injustice. The demeanor of Johnson, it is said, was harsh and despotic. It was occasionally harsh, but it was never despotic. Johnson was not in the least a despot. Johnson was a demagogue. He shouted against a shouting crowd. The very fact that he wrangled with other people is proof that other people were allowed to wrangle with him. His very brutality was based on the idea of an equal scrimmage, like that of football. It is strictly true that he bawled and banged the table because he was a modest man. He was honestly afraid of being overwhelmed or even overlooked. Addison had exquisite manners and was the king of his company. He was polite to everybody, but superior to everybody. Therefore he has been handed down forever in the immortal insult of Pope. Like Cato, give his little senate laws, and sit attentive to his own applause. Johnson, so far from being king of his company, was a sort of Irish member of his own parliament. Addison was a courteous superior, and was hated. Johnson was an insolent equal, and therefore was loved by all who knew him, and handed down in a marvelous book, which is one of the mere miracles of love. This doctrine of equality is essential to conversation. So much may be admitted by anyone who knows what conversation is. Once arguing at a table in a tavern, the most famous man on earth would wish to be obscure, so that his brilliant remarks might blaze like the stars on the background of his obscurity. To anything worth calling a man, nothing can be conceived more cold or cheerless than to be king of your company. But it may be said that in masculine sports and games, other than the great game of debate, there is definite emulation and eclipse. There is indeed emulation, but this is only an ardent sort of equality. Games are competitive, because that is the only way of making them exciting. But if anyone doubts that men must forever return to the ideal of equality, it is only necessary to answer that there is such a thing as a handicap. If men exulted in mere superiority, they would seek to see how far such superiority could go. They would be glad when one strong runner came in miles ahead of all the rest. But what men like is not the triumph of superiors, but the struggle of equals. And therefore they introduce even into their competitive sports an artificial equality. It is sad to think how few of those who arrange our sporting handicaps can be supposed with any probability to realize that they are abstract and even severe Republicans. No, the real objection to equality and self-rule has nothing to do with any of these free and festive aspects of mankind. All men are democrats when they are happy. The philosophic opponent of democracy would substantially sum up his position by saying that it will not work. Before going further, I will register in passing a protest against the assumption that working is the one test of humanity. Heaven does not work, it plays. Men are most themselves when they are free. And if I find that men are snobs in their work but democrats on their holidays, I shall take the liberty to believe their holidays. But it is this question of work which really perplexes the question of equality, and it is with that we must now deal. Perhaps the truth can be put most pointedly thus, that democracy has one real enemy, and that is civilization. Those utilitarian miracles which science has made are anti-democratic, not so much in their perversion or even in their practical result as in their primary shape and purpose. The frame-breaking rioters were right, not perhaps in thinking that machines would make fewer men workmen, but certainly in thinking that machines would make fewer men masters. More wheels do mean fewer handles. Fewer handles do mean fewer hands. The machinery of science must be individualistic and isolated. A mob can shout round a palace, but a mob cannot shout down a telephone. The specialist appears, and democracy is half spoiled at a stroke. End of the common vision.
A LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Neil Donnelly. What's Wrong with the World by G.K. Chesterton. Part 2, Chapter 4. The Insane Necessity. Common conception among the dregs of Darwinian culture is that men have slowly worked their way out of inequality into a state of comparative equality. The truth is, I fancy, almost exactly the opposite. All men have normally and naturally begun with the idea of equality. They have only abandoned it late and reluctantly, and always for some material reason of detail. They have never naturally felt that one class of men was superior to another. They have always been driven to assume it through certain practical limitations of space and time. For example, there is one element which must always tend to oligarchy, or rather to despotism. I mean the element of hurry. If the house has caught fire, a man must ring up the fire engines. A committee cannot ring them up. If a camp is surprised by night, somebody must give the order to fire. There is no time to vote it. It is solely a question of the physical limitations of time and space, not at all of any mental limitations in the mass of men commanded. If all the people in the house were men of destiny, it would still be better that they should not all talk into the telephone at once. Nay, it would be better that the silliest man of all should speak uninterrupted. If an army actually consisted of nothing but Hannibals and Napoleons, it would still be better in the case of a surprise that they should not all give orders together. Nay, it would be better if the stupidest of them all gave the orders. Thus we see that merely military subordination, so far from resting on the inequality of men, actually rests on the equality of men. Discipline does not involve the Carlylean notion that somebody is always right when everybody is wrong, and that we must discover and crown that somebody. On the contrary, discipline means that in certain frightfully rapid circumstances one can trust anybody so long as he is not everybody. The military spirit does not mean, as Carlyle fancied, obeying the strongest and wisest man. On the contrary, the military spirit means, if anything, obeying the weakest and stupidest man, obeying him merely because he is a man and not 1,000 men. Submission to a weak man is discipline. Submission to a strong man is only servility. Now it can be easily shown that the thing we call aristocracy in Europe is not in its origin in spirit an aristocracy at all. It is not a system of spiritual degrees and distinctions like, for example, the caste system of India, or even like the old Greek distinction between free men and slaves. It is simply the remains of a military organization, framed partly to sustain the sinking Roman Empire, partly to break and avenge the awful onslaught of Islam. The word duke simply means colonel, just as the word emperor simply means commander-in-chief. The whole story is told in the single title of Counts of the Holy Roman Empire, which merely means officers in the European army against the contemporary Yellow Peril. Now, in an army, nobody ever dreams of supposing that difference of rank represents a difference of moral reality. Nobody ever says about a regiment, "Your major is very humorous and energetic. Your colonel, of course, must be even more humorous and yet more energetic." No one ever says, in reporting a mess-room conversation, "Lieutenant Jones was very witty, but was naturally inferior to Captain Smith." The essence of an army is the idea of official inequality founded on unofficial equality. The colonel is not obeyed because he is the best man, but because he is the colonel. Such was probably the spirit of the system of dukes and counts when it first arose out of the military spirit and military necessities of Rome. With the decline of those necessities, it has gradually ceased to have meaning as a military organization, and become honeycombed with unclean plutocracy. Even now it is not a spiritual aristocracy. It is not so bad as all that. It is simply an army without an enemy, billeted upon the people. Man, therefore, has a specialist as well as comrade-like aspect. And the case of militarism is not the only case of such specialist submission. The tinker and tailor, as well as the soldier and sailor, require a certain rigidity of rapidity of action. At least, if the tinker is not organized, that is largely why he does not tink on any large scale. The tinker and tailor often represent the two nomadic races in Europe, the gypsy and the Jew. But the Jew alone has influence because he alone accepts some sort of discipline. Man, we say, has two sides, the specialist side, where he must have subordination, and the social side, where he must have equality. There is a truth in the saying that 10 tailors go to make a man. But we must remember also that 10 poets laureate or 10 astronomers royal go to make a man too. 10 million tradesmen go to make man himself. But humanity consists of tradesmen when they are not talking shop. The peculiar peril of our time, which I call, for argument's sake, imperialism or Caesarism, is the complete eclipse of comradeship and equality by specialism and domination. There are only two kinds of social structure conceivable: personal government and impersonal government. If my anarchic friends will not have rules, they will have rulers. Preferring personal government with its tact and flexibility is called royalism. Preferring impersonal government with its dogmas and definitions is called republicanism. Objecting broad-mindedly both to kings and creeds is called bosh. At least I know no more philosophic word for it. You can be guided by the shrewdness or presence of mind of one ruler, or by the equality and ascertained justice of one rule, but you must have one or the other, or you are not a nation, but a nasty mess. Now, men, in their aspect of equality and debate, adore the idea of rules. They develop and complicate them greatly to excess. A man finds far more regulations and definitions in his club where there are rules than in his home where there is a ruler. A deliberate assembly, the House of Commons, for instance, carries this mummery to the point of a methodical madness. The whole system is stiff with rigid unreason, like the royal court in Lewis Carroll. You would think the speaker would speak. Therefore he is mostly silent. You would think a man would take off his hat to stop and put it on to go away. Therefore he takes off his hat to walk out and puts it on to stop in. Names are forbidden, and a man must call his own father, "My right honorable friend, the member for West Birmingham." These are perhaps fantasies of decay, but fundamentally they answer a masculine appetite. Men feel that rules, even if irrational, are universal. Men feel that law is equal, even when it is not equitable. There is a wild fairness in the thing, as there is in tossing up. Again, it is gravely unfortunate that when critics do attack such cases as the Commons, it is always on the points, perhaps the few points, where the Commons are right. They denounce the House as the talking shop, and complain that it wastes time in wordy mazes. Now, this is just one respect in which the Commons are actually like the common people. If they love leisure and long debate, it is because all men love it, that they really represent England. There the Parliament does approach to the virile virtues of the pothouse. The real truth is that adumbrated in the introductory section when we spoke of the sense of home and property, as now we speak of the sense of council and community. All men do naturally love the idea of leisure, laughter, loud and equal argument, but there stands a spectre in our hall. We are conscious of the towering modern challenge that is called specialism or cutthroat competition, business. Business will have nothing to do with leisure. Business will have no truck with comradeship. Business will pretend to no patience with all the legal fictions and fantastic handicaps by which comradeship protects its egalitarian ideal. The modern millionaire, when engaged in the agreeable and typical task of sacking his own father, will certainly not refer to him as the right honorable clerk from the Laburnum Road, Brixton. Therefore there has arisen in modern life a literary fashion devoting itself to the romance of business, to great demigods of greed, and to fairyland of finance. This popular philosophy is utterly despotic and anti-democratic. This fashion is the flower of that Caesarism against which I am concerned to protest. The ideal millionaire is strong in the possession of a brain of steel. The fact that the real millionaire is rather more often strong in the possession of a head of wood does not alter the spirit and trend of the idolatry. The essential argument is specialists must be despots, men must be specialists. You cannot have equality in a soap factory, so you cannot have it anywhere. You cannot have comradeship in a wheat corner, so you cannot have it at all. We must have commercial civilization, therefore we must destroy democracy. I know that plutocrats have seldom sufficient fancy to soar to such examples as soap or wheat. They generally confine themselves, with fine freshness of mind, to a comparison between the state and a ship. One anti-democratic writer remarked that he would not like to sail in a vessel in which the cabin boy had an equal vote with the captain. It might easily be urged in answer that many a ship, the Victoria for instance, was sunk because an admiral gave an order which a cabin boy could see was wrong. But this is a debating reply. The essential fallacy is both deeper and simpler. The elementary fact is that we were all born in a state. We were not all born on a ship, like some of our great British bankers. A ship still remains a specialist experiment, like a diving bell or a flying ship. In such peculiar perils, the need for promptitude constitutes the need for autocracy. But we live and die in the vessel of the state, and if we cannot find freedom, camaraderie, and the popular element in the state, we cannot find it at all. And the modern doctrine of commercial despotism means that we shall not find it at all. Our specialist trades in their highly civilized state cannot, it says, be run without the whole brutal business of bossing and sacking, too old at 40, and all the rest of the filth. And they must be run, and therefore we call on Caesar. Nobody but the Superman could descend to do such dirty work. Now, to reiterate my title, this is what is wrong. This is the huge modern heresy of altering the human soul to fit its conditions, instead of altering human conditions to fit the human soul. If soap boiling is really inconsistent with brotherhood, so much the worse for soap boiling, not for brotherhood. If civilization really cannot get on with democracy, so much the worse for civilization, not for democracy. Certainly it would be far better to go back to village communes, if they really are communes. Certainly it would be better to do without soap rather than to do without society. Certainly we would sacrifice all our wires, wheels, systems, specialties, physical science, and frenzied finance for 1/2 hour of happiness, such as has often come to us with comrades in a common tavern. I do not say the sacrifice will be necessary. I only say it will be easy. End of The Insane Necessity.
The Unmilitary Suffragette. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Holdsworth. What's Wrong with the World by G.K. Chesterton, Part 3, Chapter 1. The Unmilitary Suffragette. It would be better to adopt in this chapter the same process that appeared a piece of mental justice in the last. My general opinions on the feminine question are such as many suffragettes would warmly approve, and it would be easy to state them without any open reference to the current controversy. But just as it seemed more decent to say first that I was not in favour of imperialism, even in its practical and popular sense, so it seems more decent to say the same of female suffrage in its practical and popular sense. In other words, it is only fair to state, however hurriedly, the superficial objection to the suffragettes before we go on to the really subtle questions behind the suffrage. Well, to get this honest but unpleasant business over, the objection to the suffragettes is not that they are militant suffragettes. On the contrary, it is that they are not militant enough. A revolution is a military thing. It has all the military virtues, one of which is that it comes to an end. Two parties fight with deadly weapons, but under certain rules, for arbitrary honour. The party that wins becomes the government and proceeds to govern. The aim of civil war, like the aim of all war, is peace. Now the suffragettes cannot raise civil war in this soldierly and decisive sense. First, because they are women, and secondly, because there are very few women. But they can raise something else, which is altogether another pair of shoes. They do not create revolution. What they do create is anarchy. And the difference between these is not a question of violence, but a question of fruitfulness and finality. Revolution of its nature produces government. Anarchy only produces more anarchy. Men may have what opinions they please about the beheading of King Charles or King Louis, but they cannot deny that Bradshaw and Cromwell ruled, that Carnot and Napoleon governed. Someone conquered, something occurred. You can only knock off the king's head once, but you can knock off the king's hat any number of times. Destruction is finite. Obstruction is infinite. So long as rebellion takes the form of mere disorder, instead of an attempt to enforce a new order, there is no logical end to it. It can feed on itself and renew itself forever. If Napoleon had not wanted to be a consul, but only wanted to be a nuisance, he could possibly have prevented any government arising successfully out of the Revolution. But such a proceeding would not have deserved the dignified name of rebellion. It is exactly this unmilitant quality in the suffragettes that makes their superficial problem. The problem is that their action has none of the advantages of ultimate violence. It does not afford a test. War is a dreadful thing, but it does prove 2 points sharply and unanswerably: numbers and an unnatural valor. One does discover the 2 urgent matters: how many rebels there are alive, and how many are ready to be dead. But a tiny minority, even an interested minority, may maintain mere disorder forever. There is also, of course, in the case of these women, the further falsity that is introduced by their sex. It is false to state the matter as a mere brutal question of strength. If his muscles give a man a vote, then his horse ought to have 2 votes, and his elephant 5 votes. The truth is more subtle than that. It is that bodily outbreak is a man's instinctive weapon, like the hoofs to a horse or the tusks to an elephant. All riot is a threat of war, but the woman is brandishing a weapon she can never use. There are many weapons that she could and does use. If, for example, all the women nagged for a vote, they would get it in a month. But there again, one must remember, it would be necessary to get all the women to nag. And that brings us to the end of the political surface of the matter. The working objection to the suffrage philosophy is simply that overmastering millions of women do not agree with it. I am aware that some maintain that women ought to have votes, whether the majority wants them or not. But this is surely a strange and childish case of setting up formal democracy to the destruction of actual democracy. What should the mass of women decide if they do not decide their general place in the state? These people practically say that females may vote about everything except about female suffrage. But having again cleared my conscience of my merely political and possibly unpopular opinion, I will again cast back and try to treat the matter in a slower and more sympathetic style, attempt to trace the real roots of women's position in the Western state, and the causes of our existing traditions, or perhaps prejudices, upon the point. And for this purpose it is again necessary to travel far from the modern topic, the mere suffragette of today, and to go back to subjects which, though much more old, are, I think, considerably more fresh. End of the unmilitary suffragette.
The Universal Stick. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Lorimer. What's Wrong with the World by G.K. Chesterton. Part 3, Chapter 2, The Universal Stick. Cast your eye round the room in which you sit, and select some 3 or 4 things that have been with man almost since his beginning, which at least we hear of early in the centuries and often among the tribes. Let me suppose that you see a knife on the table, a stick in the corner, or a fire on the hearth. About each of these you will notice one speciality, that not one of them is special. Each of these ancestral things is a universal thing, made to supply many different needs, and while tottering pedants nose about to find the cause and origin of some old custom, the truth is that it had 50 causes, or 100 origins. The knife is meant to cut wood, to cut cheese, to cut pencils, to cut throats, for a myriad ingenious or innocent human objects. The stick is meant partly to hold a man up, partly to knock a man down, partly to point with like a finger post, partly to balance with like a balancing pole, partly to trifle with like a cigarette, partly to kill with like a club of a giant. It is a crutch and a cudgel, an elongated finger and an extra leg. The case is the same, of course, with the fire, about which the strangest modern views have arisen. A queer fancy seems to be current that a fire exists to warm people. It exists to warm people, to light their darkness, to raise their spirits, to toast their muffins, to air their rooms, to cook their chestnuts, to tell stories to their children, to make checkered shadows on the walls, to boil their hurried kettles, and to be the red heart of a man's house, and that hearth for which, as the great heathens said, a man should die. Now it is the great mark of our modernity that people are always proposing substitutes for these old things, and these substitutes always answer one purpose where the old thing answered 10. The modern man will wave a cigarette instead of a stick. He will cut his pencil with a little screwing pencil sharpener instead of a knife, and he will even boldly offer to be warmed by hot water pipes instead of a fire. I have my doubts about pencil sharpeners even for sharpening pencils, and about hot water pipes even for heat. But when we think of all of those other requirements that these institutions answered, there opens before us the whole horrible harlequinade of our civilization. We see as in a vision a world where a man tries to cut his throat with a pencil sharpener, where a man must learn single stick with a cigarette, where a man must try to toast muffins at electric lamps, and see red and golden castles in the surface of hot water pipes. The principle of which I speak can be seen everywhere in a comparison between the ancient and universal things and the modern and specialist things. The object of a theodolite is to lie level. The object of a stick is to swing loose at any angle, to whirl like the very wheel of liberty. The object of a lancet is to lance. When used for slashing, gashing, ripping, lopping off heads and limbs, it is a disappointing instrument. The object of an electric light is merely to light, a despicable modesty. And the object of an asbestos stove, I wonder what is the object of an asbestos stove? If a man found a coil of rope in a desert, he could at least think of all the things that can be done with a coil of rope, and some of them might even be practical. He could tow a boat or lasso a horse. He could play cat's cradle or pick oakum. He could construct a rope ladder for an eloping heiress, or cord her boxes for a traveling maiden aunt. He could learn to tie a bow, or he could hang himself. Far otherwise with the unfortunate traveler who should find a telephone in the desert. You can telephone with a telephone. You cannot do anything else with it. And though this is one of the wildest joys of life, it falls by one degree from its full delirium when there is nobody to answer you. The contention is, in brief, that you must pull up 100 roots, and not one, before you uproot any of these hoary and simple expedients. It is only with great difficulty that a modern scientific sociologist can be got to see that any old method has a leg to stand on. But almost every old method has 4 or 5 legs to stand on. Almost all the old institutions are quadrupeds, and some of them are centipedes. Consider these cases, old and new, and you will observe the operation of a general tendency. Everywhere there was one big thing that served 6 purposes. Everywhere now there are 6 things. Or rather, and there is the trouble, there are just 5.5. Nevertheless, we will not say that this separation and specialism is entirely useless or inexcusable. I have often thanked God for the telephone. I may any day thank God for the lancet. And there is none of these brilliant and narrow inventions, except of course the asbestos stove, which might not be at some moment necessary and lovely. But I do not think the most austere upholder of specialism will deny that there is in these old many-sided institutions an element of unity and universality which may well be preserved in its due proportion and place. Spiritually, at least, it will be admitted that some all-round balance is needed to equalize the extravagance of experts. It would not be difficult to carry the parable of the knife and stick into higher regions. Religion, the immortal maiden, has been a maid of all work as well as a servant of mankind. She provided men at once with the theoretic laws of an unalterable cosmos, and also with the practical rules of the rapid and thrilling game of morality. She taught logic to the student and told fairy tales to the children. It was her business to confront the nameless gods whose fears are on all flesh, and also to see the streets were spotted with silver and scarlet, that there was a day for wearing ribbons or an hour for ringing bells. The large uses of religion have been broken up into lesser specialities, just as the uses of the hearth have been broken up into hot water pipes and electric bulbs. The romance of ritual and colored emblem has been taken over by that narrowest of all trades, modern art, the sort called arts for art's sake. And men are in modern practice informed that they may use all symbols, so long as they mean nothing by them. The romance of conscience has been dried up into the science of ethics, which may well be called decency for decency's sake, decency unborn of cosmic energies and barren of artistic flower. The cry to the dim gods, cut off from ethics and cosmology, has become mere physical research. Everything has been sundered from everything else, and everything has grown cold. Soon we shall hear of specialists dividing the tune from the words of a song, on the ground that they spoil each other. And I did once meet a man who openly advocated the separation of almonds and raisins. This world is all one wild divorce court. Nevertheless, there are many who still hear in their souls the thunder of authority of human habit. Those whom man hath joined, let no man sunder. This book must avoid religion, but there must, I say, be many, religious and irreligious, who will concede that this power of answering many purposes was a sort of strength, which should not wholly die out of our lives. As a part of personal character, even the moderns will agree that many-sidedness is a merit, and a merit that may easily be overlooked. This balance and universality has been the vision of many groups of men in many ages. It was the liberal education of Aristotle, the jack-of-all-trades artistry of Leonardo da Vinci and his friends, the august amateurishness of the cavalier person of quality, like Sir William Temple or the great Earl of Dorset. It has appeared in literature in our time in the most erratic and opposite shapes, set to almost inaudible music by Walter Pater, and enunciated through a foghorn by Walt Whitman. But the great mass of men have always been unable to achieve this literal universality because of the nature of their work in the world. Not, let it be noted, because of the existence of their work. Leonardo da Vinci must have worked pretty hard. On the other hand, many a government office clerk, village constable, or elusive plumber may do, to all human appearance, no work at all, and yet show no signs of the Aristotelian universalism. What makes it difficult for the average man to be a universalist is that the average man has to be a specialist. He has not only to learn one trade, but to learn it so well as to uphold him in a more or less ruthless society. This is generally true of males, from the first hunter to the last electrical engineer. Each has not merely to act, but to excel. Nimrod has not only to be a mighty hunter before the Lord, but also a mighty hunter before the other hunters. The electrical engineer has to be a very electrical engineer, or he is outstripped by engineers yet more electrical. Those very miracles of the human mind on which the modern world prides itself, and rightly in the main, would be impossible without a certain concentration which disturbs the pure balance of reason more than does religious bigotry. No creed can be so limiting as that awful adjuration that the cobbler must not go beyond his last. So the largest and wildest shots of our world are but in one direction and with a defined trajectory. The gunner cannot go beyond his shot, and his shot so often falls short. The astronomer cannot go beyond his telescope, and his telescope goes such a little way. All these are like men who have stood on the high peak of a mountain and seen the horizon like a single ring, and who then descend down different paths toward different towns, traveling slow or fast. It is right. There must be people traveling to different towns. There must be specialists. But shall no one behold the horizon? Shall all mankind be specialist surgeons or particular plumbers? Shall all humanity be monomaniac? Tradition has decided that only half of humanity shall be monomaniac. It has decided that in every home there shall be a tradesman and a jack of all trades. But it has also decided, among other things, that the jack of all trades shall be a Jill of all trades. It has decided, rightly or wrongly, that this specialism and this universalism shall be divided between the sexes. Cleverness shall be left for men, and wisdom for women. For cleverness kills wisdom. That is one of the few sad and certain things. But for women, this ideal of comprehensive capacity, or common sense, must long ago have been washed away. It must have melted in the frightful furnaces of ambition and eager technicality. A man must be partly a one-idea man, because he is a one-weaponed man, and he is flung naked into the fight. The world's demand comes to him direct, to his wife indirectly. In short, he must, as the books on success say, give his best, and what a small part of a man his best is. His second and third best are often much better. If he is the first violin, he must fiddle for life. He must not remember that he is a fine fourth bagpipe, a fair 15th billiard cue, a foil, a fountain pen, a hand at whist, a gun, and an image of God. End of The Universal Stick. Recording by David Lorimer, Van Cleve, Kentucky, March 29, 2009. dlorimer.blogspot.com